we can all wax at length about the beauties and wonders of music. Um, what matters, what matters is that that overarching reputation for music and association and characterization, that way of thinking of music as something that is in and of itself good and positive, coexists with some knowledge that this is not always the case. We most often have paradoxical and contradictory understandings that might rest at the, let's say, more implicit level of our understanding about music. We might know that music can galvanize hatred of other people. We might know that it can spread contempt for other people, that it can cause disunity, discord, that it can be the occasion for conflict between people. We can speak about that in high arching ideological terms if one wants to think about the role of music in the Nazi in the Nazi regime, or you can think about it in much more quotidian, much more casual terms, fights that break out at concerts. Um, let's say, illicit use of drugs or alcohol or sex that co-occur with the loss of norms surrounding music making and music consumption. All of this is there too. It's to say that we're dealing with an art form that has a reputation as being one of the inherently good pieces of humanity and the human condition, on the one hand, while we also kind of know and might encounter the products of the fact that music actually is a much more ambiguous moral agent in the world. Can you all hear me? I'm speaking a lot. How I'm going to be speaking quickly. So. Anyways, so with that as a background, that's what the problem is. So along comes me. Um, Lydia just introduced to you what I study and what I work on. I study one of these incarnations of music making that a lot of people would look at as being inherently bad. All right, music's role at coalescing, in many cases, a white or national majority, and thereby marginalizing those who are outside of that, alternately invoking violence, rallying to violence, all of those things. And not only do I do that, it just has been my nature. I seem to just be destined to come into conflict with people. I I also like to talk and write about this music in ways that stir controversy. Um, in part because I think it so often is discussed in very, very uninspired and uninquisitive terms, this particular type of music. Um, and I think that I would be encountering controversy with this no matter what, no matter if I were in international affairs, political science, history. But I have a lot of special challenges when I speak about this coming from and often speaking to a community of musicians and music scholars. Um, and let me give you a few examples. Um, when I am, let's say, speaking to a more general audience, um, for instance, I've given a lot of community presentations in Boulder. I've spoken at the Boulder bookstore, or there's this country club-ish sort of group near in between Arapahoe and Canyon, West Boulder. I forget what they call it. And and they hear, oh, a music professor is coming, and I come and I start talking, and then pretty soon I'm talking to them about white power music, and we're talking about the way that you know music is galvanizing some of these organizations. I can just tell in the room I've spoiled the evening for these people because they were thinking music, entertainment, fun, or music beauty, or music goodness. All these other associations that go along with music, in which I think we're expected, as performers or as commentators, we're expected to sort of provide. That's our signature. We'll leave the serious stuff to the serious actors at the university. We're here for the light entertainment, right? We are the cocktail hour of intellectual life. And so when you come bringing that no one wants there's this pushback against it. And I wish I could be more specific, but it's a sort of air. The most I could say about it is when I start speaking and when they really realize that they're not getting a typical music presentation, there's this air of kind of wanting to withdraw, right? So that's a challenge. And likewise, I think if you pay attention, if I want to even say that what I'm describing, what I study, what I've written books and articles and studied for years, if I even want to say that it is music worthy of study, worthy of reflection and scholarly investigation, that too gives pushback. Sometimes from those, they can, thankfully at CU this has not happened, but in other institutions where I've worked, colleagues who think that the only music that deserves that sort of commentary and investigation is the high arts, is music that in its structure, in its, you know, the music itself, its theoretical construction, is sophisticated and separate and should have the honor bestowed upon it of being studied by experts and people with credentials. So when they hear some of the least produced, trashiest, most poorly performed punk music ever in the world, namely the stuff that comes out of white nationalists or neo-Nazi circles, which is what I've studied, there too there's a sort of contentiousness there. Like what in the world? This is not music. Music to me is something that is rich, sophisticated, nuanced, and valuable for, let's say, the theoretician to look at. Those are two areas where I see this pushback coming. For me, there could be others. There are lots of ways in which we can have conversations about music that challenge the notion that it is something inherently good, beautiful, righteous, truthful, noble. There is the widespread phenomenon of, for example, of people listening to popular music that espouses views against their own, that they themselves do not hold. If you don't believe that, look at the consumption of either heavy metal or rap music among American youth in particular. How much misogyny, violence, racism there can be wrapped up in that music that surely the consumers would not espouse and endorse if you ask them, and yet it's the type of music, especially that young teenagers cannot get enough of. And when they grow older, they seem to keep wanting to listen to it. So it's there for everyone to talk about. What do we do with this? Well, I want to hear your thoughts, and I certainly want to leave room for a conversation, but let me suggest this to you. I think it is very important for us as scholars and as performers and as representatives of this art form to let it be a complex, multi-sided, multivocal art form. Let it be that which we know that it is. Um, Practically speaking, that means to work against the notion that music is something inherently good. I don't know if that makes good professional or social sense for us, but I think it's more intellectually honest and defensible. That music is not the good aspect of humanity necessarily, but it is instead the playing ground, the battlefield for various forces, various identities and practices that make up who we are. And they are going to, like human beings themselves, be varied and contentious and up for debate. Um, so while I was inspired to reflect on all this based on an article that an ethnomusicology colleague of mine wrote, proclaiming music's positive valence, observing that reputation operating in music's social life in various settings and across various eras, it has ultimately become, for me, a call to action to push back against it, to let music be human, to anthropomorphize, excuse me, and let that nuance and multivocality and multifacetedness shine through. It's a short point, but I'm talking a lot and I'm speaking quickly, so I hope that people can follow me. I do want to allow half of this time of the half hour we have here to have a conversation. So with that said, I'll turn things over to you.
Wow. So I think that's really interesting, and not something I had ever personally considered. This idea that I guess I had never considered that we all work under the assumption that music is inherently good, and never having realized that, I guess I never really considered the opposite, which is that if it were inherently good, it would be the only art form that was. Um, so that would be kind of strange. So I'd love to hear questions that anyone has for Dr. Teitelbaum.
Something I was thinking about is, you know, in theory it makes sense to me, but then what does this look like in practice? You know, when you're in front of a group of students and you're trying to, talk about this and kind of deconstruct this a little bit.
Hmm. Yeah, a great question, Lydia. I mean, at times I feel like we can draw a sort of conceptual parallel between goodness and entertainment and fun and leisure. And especially those of us teaching upper level academic classes in music love to be the ones to kill the fun, right? For our undergraduate students who, especially the non-majors who are taking a music class because they want to relax this semester and they've worked so hard, but now they want to have a little fun, right? Um, so I wonder if some of the beginnings of this process exist there, in rendering music something more than just an atmospheric accompaniment to real life. Something could start there. Um, that's a thought. Curious of others. You all have taught in a classroom, right? Is that true? Or at least you're preparing to. I know a number of you have. Um, Maybe to get things going, could I ask you, how do you think you portray music? Do you think that there is an overarching single portrayal of what the art form is in your classrooms or in your studios?
I think I've done a good job if they go away questioning their own understanding of what music is, like, well, I thought music was this, but now through taking that class, like this, the construction noise outside, if I record that and
Mm-hmm.
say it's music, is it music? Like, so.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. Just questioning the ontology of music. Absolutely. Others, anyone else care to share? How do you set the tone for your conversations about music?
I think it definitely depends on the audience that you're speaking to, whether it's peers or colleagues or actual students.
Mm-hmm.
I think, kind of with what Brandon mentioned and Caleb mentioned in terms of the inherent qualities of music being positive, um, it brings into question a lot of music from the late 20th century to now, in that
Mm-hmm.
music is not either positive or negative. It just is. When you talk a lot about like Lou Harrison, especially John Luther Adams, and his music is about place. It's not good or
Mm-hmm.
bad. And soundscapes when you get into that type of matter. But I guess a lot of the classroom teaching that many of us probably do with non majors or undergraduates or young students in private study is about that introductory positive versus negative. Like music is only good or it is only bad.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but there's a lot of kind of discrepancies in determining what music's place aesthetically or philosophically is in moving into now in the late 20th century.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. So you feel, Grace, like there's kind of been an opening up of that conversation. Am I understanding that with just your closing words right there?
I think so, because if you start to look at the perspective of how people intake any type of music,
Mm-hmm.
where you mentioned earlier non majors taking a music class to relax, and they might not feel that the inherently positive is positive, that there's kind of an influx and a larger gap for interpretation now, I
Mm-hmm.
guess, is kind of what you just brought up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, because I think that would be a good thing, for sure. Definitely, definitely.
Yeah, I think, Grace, what you just said made me think about, I mean, this isn't necessarily, how it approaches in my teaching, but like I'm just thinking about how students come in with like just preconceptions about like music that's bad just because they don't like it, or you know and I think that that is kind of a different conversation. And when you're talking about like bad in aesthetics versus bad in like intent and like ethics, there's sometimes those two get conflated in some ways, and so I think that's part of why it's so tricky.
Ab- Absolutely. If I can jump in there, it there's a way of thinking. It goes well beyond music that I think is worth targeting and waging war against, which is that we want to see a sort of consistency. It's like we want to have a sort of template, with one file with good and the other with bad, and any person, object, expression that is displeasurable in one category needs to be displeasurable in all of them. We want our political opponents to be ugly, stupid, with malintent, misinformed, and and if there's variance there, it upsets us. We want to go after the person who put that in front of us as well. Um, and so this notion that aesthetic beauty also will parallel moral integrity or moral righteousness is is a delightful cow to be sacrificed, or what is the phrase? To slaughter. Sacred cow
um,
to slaughter. Mm.
I think we also do ourselves a disservice when we do that, for a lot of reasons, because the last thing you were talking about, like political opponents making them monoliths, the last thing you want to do is think someone who is actually quite smart but just believes everything that you don't, is to believe that they're stupid. Because when you believe that they're stupid, you leave yourself susceptible to how smart they might be and malicious they might be.
Of among other reasons, that's one,
Yeah.
right? So then you're living in a pretend world, right? Um, I'm gonna now stop me because I was thinking about this with what Lydia was saying here too. Stop me if anyone wants to go in another direction. But another aspect of this is not just talking about music, but it's also talking about music in the context of a university. How many of you are hoping to work in a university in some capacity someday? Okay, some. Okay, great. Um, so if we think in those terms, do you think it is the university's role to uh, instill students with an understanding of the world that ought to be, or to teach them about the world that is?
I think that depends on where the funding of the university comes from. I think a private university can instill whatever moral code they want to, but if it's a public institution,
Uh-huh.
they can, individual professors obviously are going to have views that they either try to impart or don't. But I think the university as a whole standing for one particular viewpoint over another, as long as they're not, inciting violence or infringing, literally infringing rights of their students or something like that, then I think they can't. They have to be a sort of neutral force.
Yes.
I think that gets into a lot of gray area, kind of with what you were touching on, Caleb, and talking about if you're talking about the world that is versus what the world ought to be, it's very pejorative. You could take it as far as to that kind of instilling in a similar way, like a political belief system. Morals are subjective, unfortunately. Um, you could say unfortunately, you could say fortunately. It's really up to the person, but I feel like it's college or a university's responsibility to give different view sets to let somebody understand and create a viewpoint without pointing them to what is or what isn't. And I do think that that's not something that really happens now. It's kind of, here's what we know, this is what we think we should know, and this is what we want you to know. That there's that kind of disconnect in that thought process as well.
Now,
Yeah, there also seems to, oh, sorry.
go for it.
There also just seems to be a lack of wanting to teach people to form their own ideas. So like, instead of like, here's the information we want you to know when you leave, like, yeah, sure, you have to have that, but there also has to be like, here's how you can take that information or any information you might receive after you leave, because believe it or not, you won't learn everything there is to know in these 4 years, and be able to process it and form your own opinions about it, I think is something that should be focused more on as well.
Now, if I could interject, when I put that question out, we kind of went in the direction of almost political opinion, right? In terms of what is versus what should be. How would that manifest for music?
I'm sorry, would you mind repeating that last sentence, please?
I'm sorry, I have toddlers running around me here.
That's all right.
I was wondering, how could this all manifest for music? How could a music school be teaching the world that is or the world that ought to be, that we would, presumably the people in charge, would like it to be?
I think the first step that I've taken with students before is to point out that music is a place where we can exercise a lot of like thought activities, and where we can understand how culture interacts and how culture is created or influences other things. So I think for me, what the approach that I've had the most success with students is to use music as a way to frame culture and to frame reality and experiences of the world. Um, and then I think there's room for conversation between the world that is and the world that you want to see, or the various models of those things, and the gaps between them become more apparent when I'm using music not just as, well, here's a craft, here's an art, here we study the technical aspects of it, but also as a reflection of other things. I'm thinking of the term cultural consistency, which we used in our recitation this morning.
I also think that introducing any sort of objective view on aesthetic is a very, very slippery slope, because aesthetic is so subjective. So when you introduce any sort of objectivity in regard to aesthetic, you're going the way of the world that ought to be, the music that ought to be.
Absolutely. And briefly, Caleb, Lydia, we're wrapping up in 2 minutes here, right?
Oh yeah, sorry.
So I might leave you then with this, based on those last two comments, leave you with this idea. My personal thought is that I want universities to be both, teaching the world that is and the world that ought to be. They both need to be there to keep each other in check, I think. Um, I think it's very important, especially if we're living in a more secularized society, that the university doesn't start to fill the role that a church would, exclusively, that everyone assumes that this is the place to come and be taught what is right, and morally right in that case. I think that there needs to be a lot of acceptance of conflict here. And what Jessica and Caleb just mentioned is part of the reason why I'm so excited to be in a music school in all the places, because I happen to think that we are better positioned than most other places on campus to let those conflicts rage. Despite everything I've said, I do think there are reasons to think that music has at least some tendencies towards a positive valence. I don't want it to take over, certainly not. But I think that there is something of a yearning or a longing that can be captured in music. At the same time, it is, as Jessica put it, a sort of register for so many different impetuses in human society and in the human condition. What better place to see that struggle playing out, to stand and to be humbled by its imponderability at a certain level than music? So all of this, I hope, if nothing else, it inspires you a little bit to take the difficult topics and when you're speaking and playing music and make it part of your output and your public persona. So.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Teitelbaum, for being here, and thanks to everyone else who attended. We really appreciate having people here, and we're going to have another one of these. Is it a month from today, Lydia? More info to come on another one of these. I think, yeah, I think it's October 28th, and I am doing a little talk for that one. So
Awesome.
Great. Thank you so much for coming.
Keep up the good work, y'all.
All right. Bye-bye.